The accidental interrogator. The path to becoming the Third Reich's most effective interrogator of Allied fighter pilots began not with ideological fervor or military ambition, but with a failed medical exam and a wife's well-placed connections. Hanns Scharff, born in 1907 into a wealthy family in Rassenburg, East Prussia, was the antithesis of the archetypal Nazi. He was a sophisticated, multilingual businessman who had spent a decade before the war living and working in South Africa, managing the overseas operations of his family's textile empire. He spoke flawless English, was married to an Englishwoman, and his worldview was shaped more by international commerce and art than by the rigid doctrines of National Socialism. When war erupted in 1939, Scharff was in Germany on business. Trapped by the conflict, he was eventually conscripted into the Wehrmacht in 1941. His initial posting was as a Panzergrenadier, a role for which his slight build and gentle demeanor were woefully unsuited. Destiny, however, intervened. After suffering a series of health issues, he was declared unfit for frontline duty. While convalescing, his wife, Margaret, leveraged a family connection to a high-ranking Luftwaffe general to secure him a transfer. He was to be assigned a role as an interpreter. Scharff arrived at the Durchgangslager der Luftwaffe, transit camp of the Air Force, at Obergefreiter, near Frankfurt, in the spring of 1943. This facility, operating under the formal name Auswertestelle West, Evaluation Center West, was the primary interrogation center for all captured Allied airmen on the Western Front. His initial duties were mundane, translating for other interrogators and processing the endless paperwork that accompanies prisoners of war. He observed the standard methods of the day, a mixture of direct questioning, solitary confinement to break morale, and sometimes veiled threats. He saw interrogators feigning anger, attempting to intimidate proud, defiant young pilots into revealing information. He saw it fail, time and time again. The Allied airmen, particularly the American flyboys, were well trained in counterinterrogation techniques. They were instructed to give only their name, rank, and serial number, a mantra they repeated with stubborn resolve. Scharff, watching from the periphery, began to form a radically different theory. These men were not criminals to be broken, they were professional soldiers, proud, intelligent, and fiercely loyal. Intimidation would only reinforce their defiance. What, he wondered, would happen if they were treated not as prisoners, but as respected adversaries, as fellow knights of the air? Want to know more than what's in the textbooks? Subscribe to World War II, Unfiltered, and join our community of history explorers. Your likes and comments help the channel grow. His chance to test this theory came unexpectedly. His superior officer, in charge of the fighter pilot section, was abruptly transferred to the Russian front as a punishment for failing to extract critical information about the new P-51 Mustang. With the senior staff in disarray and a backlog of freshly captured American aces, Scharff, the unassuming interpreter, was suddenly promoted. He was given temporary command of the fighter intelligence section. He was not a commissioned officer, merely an Obergefreiter. He had no formal training in intelligence or psychology. All he possessed was his fluent English, his innate understanding of the Anglo-American mindset, and a revolutionary idea that kindness was not a weakness, but the ultimate skeleton key. He resolved to abandon the entire playbook of conventional interrogation. There would be no threats, no shouting, no solitary confinement. Instead, he would offer his guests, as he called them, courtesy, respect, and the illusion of camaraderie. His first true test subject would be Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, a formidable American fighter group commander and one of the USAF's most respected aces. The established interrogators had failed to get anything from him. The stage was set for Hanns Scharff to either prove his radical methods or face the same fate as his predecessor. The Scharff method, a symphony of subtlety. Hanns Scharff's approach, which would later be studied by U.S. military intelligence and integrated into its own training manuals, was a masterclass in psychological manipulation disguised as benevolent hospitality. He meticulously dismantled the prisoner-captor dynamic from the very first encounter. When a new pilot, often disoriented, exhausted, and expecting the worst, was brought to him, they were not dragged into a barren, dimly lit room. Instead, they were escorted to Scharff's own comfortable office. The first thing Scharff would do was offer a firm, polite handshake and introduce himself simply as Hans. He would invite the pilot to sit, offer him a German cigarette, or a prized American one if available, and perhaps a cup of real coffee, a luxury in wartime Germany. He never wore a uniform during these initial meetings, preferring civilian clothes to diminish the military hierarchy. He spoke not as a German officer to an enemy prisoner, but as one man to another. The questions were never about military secrets. They were personal, disarming. How was your flight? It must have been rough. Are you injured? Let me have the doctor take a look. Do you have a family? I have a wife and daughter myself. This initial phase was designed to lower the pilot's guard and establish a baseline of trust. The core of his technique, however, was what he called the illusion of knowing it all. Scharff was a meticulous researcher. Before a pilot even entered his office, Scharff and his small team would have already compiled an exhaustive dossier on him. This was created by painstakingly cross-referencing information from a multitude of sources, documents found on the airman's person, insignias on his uniform, markings on the plane wreckage, articles in Allied hometown newspapers, which Germany received via neutral countries like Switzerland and Portugal, previous interrogations, and even casual chatter picked up by listening devices in the holding cells. When the pilot sat down, Scharff would begin a friendly, rambling monologue, appearing to share information freely. He'd casually mention the pilot's squadron number, his home base in England, the name of his commanding officer, the type of missions they flew, and even the name of the girl painted on the nose of his aircraft. Ah yes, the 352nd Fighter Group out of Bodny, he might say. You fly the P-51B, a fine machine, though we hear you have some trouble with the guns jamming above 20,000 feet. Is Colonel Graham still your CO? I always enjoyed reading about his exploits. The effect on the prisoner was profound. The pilot, trained to reveal nothing, would listen to Scharff lay out what seemed to be the sum total of Allied knowledge. The German interrogator already appeared to know everything. In this context, confirming a small, seemingly insignificant detail felt harmless. Scharff would craft his performance to include deliberate, minor errors. He might misstate a unit's call sign or the location of a supply depot. The natural impulse of a proud expert, and these pilots were experts, is to correct an error. No, the pilot might interject, we don't get our parts from that depot, we get them from Depot X. And with that simple correction, a new, verified piece of intelligence was gained. Scharff never wrote anything down in the prisoner's presence, doing so would break the spell. He maintained the fiction that this was just a casual chat. Only later, in the privacy of his office, would he meticulously document every slip, every confirmation, every new thread that could be woven into the tapestry of his knowledge for the next interrogation. It was a slow, patient, and intellectually demanding process, a world away from the Gestapo's brutal shortcuts. The ace and the corporal, the case of Hub Zemke. The arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke at Oberursel in late 1944 was a major intelligence prize for the Luftwaffe. Zemke was more than just a high-scoring ace, he was a brilliant tactician and the revered commander of the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, one of the most successful American fighter units in Europe. He was known for his iron discipline and sharp mind, the very model of an officer who would give nothing away. He had been shot down by flak and his capture was a severe blow to the USAAF. For Hans Scharff, interrogating Zemke would be the ultimate test of his unorthodox method. When Zemke was ushered into Scharff's office, he was prepared for a battle of wills. Instead, he found a polite, soft-spoken German who offered him a chair and expressed concern for his well-being. Scharff began by laying out Zemke's entire service record, from his pre-war career to his command of the 56th. He discussed the group's transition from the P-47 Thunderbolt to the P-51 Mustang, even mentioning specific pilots in Zemke's squadron by name. Zemke remained stone-faced, providing only his name, rank, and serial number. Scharff, unfazed, simply smiled and changed the subject. He talked about his own life in South Africa, about art, about the shared experiences of flying. He then suggested a walk. Leaving the confines of the interrogation center, the two men, the captured American colonel and the German corporal, strolled through the nearby Taunus forest. Surrounded by the tranquility of nature, the adversarial dynamic melted away. Scharff pointed out different species of trees and birds, speaking more like a naturalist than a spy. He never pressed Zemke for military information directly. Instead, he created an atmosphere of relaxed conversation between equals. During one such walk, Scharff casually mentioned the new K-14 gun sight being fitted to the latest Mustangs. He described its function in impressive, though slightly inaccurate, detail. Zemke, a technical expert and proud of his command's equipment, couldn't resist. He corrected Scharff on a few key points, explaining precisely how the gyroscopic sight worked and the tactical advantage it gave his pilots in deflection shooting. It was a seemingly minor technical discussion, but for German intelligence, it was a goldmine. It confirmed the capabilities of a piece of technology that was giving Luftwaffe pilots fits and provided crucial data for developing countertactics. Scharff's relationship with Zemke deepened over several weeks. They shared meals, which Scharff often supplemented with packages from his own family. They debated the course of the war, not as enemies, but as professionals with different perspectives. Scharff learned about the morale and operational readiness of Zemke's unit, not by asking, but by listening to Zemke's proud anecdotes about his boys. He gleaned information on Allied bomber escort tactics, range limitations, and communication procedures, all woven into seemingly innocuous conversations. By the time Zemke was transferred to a permanent POW camp, Stalag Luft-I, Scharff had compiled a comprehensive report on the state of the 8th Air Force's premier fighter group. He had done it without raising his voice, without making a single threat, and in the process, had earned the grudging respect of the American ace. Zemke would later state that Scharff was a master of his trade and that he knew more about my own outfit than I did. This was the genius of the Scharff method. He made his subjects willing, if unwitting, collaborators. The psychology of the cage, empathy as a weapon. Understanding Hans Scharff's success requires a deep dive into the psychological state of a captured aviator. These were young men, often in their early 20s, who one moment were masters of a powerful, technologically advanced fighting machine, soaring at 30,000 feet, and the next were utterly powerless, brought crashing down to earth. The psychological shock was immense. They faced injury, disorientation, and the terrifying uncertainty of their fate. They were trained to expect hostility, brutality, and a battle for their very identity. Scharff's genius lay in his complete subversion of these expectations. Instead of confrontation, he offered solace. Instead of anonymity, he offered recognition. Instead of hostility, he offered a strange, disorienting form of friendship. This approach was a calculated assault on the prisoner's psychological defenses. The training to resist a snarling, threatening interrogator was useless against a man who offered you a hot meal and asked about your family. Scharff understood that these pilots were intensely proud professionals. He leveraged this pride masterfully. He would engage them in technical debates about aircraft performance, the climb rate of a P-51D versus FW-190D9, or the high-altitude maneuverability of a Spitfire Mk9. The pilots, eager to defend the honor of their machines and their own piloting skills, would often inadvertently reveal performance specifications, weaknesses, and operational ceilings. Scharff framed these conversations as professional shop talk, two knights of the air discussing their respective steeds. He created a space where the pilot felt respected as an expert, and in asserting that expertise, he gave away priceless intelligence. Scharff also cataloged personal details with an almost obsessive zeal. If a pilot mentioned a girlfriend named Betty, that name went into the file. Weeks later, when another pilot from the same squadron was captured, Scharff could ask, "How is old John doing? Is he still with Betty?" This created a powerful impression that Scharff was a central, all-knowing hub of information, making the new prisoner feel isolated and believing that his own secrets were already compromised. Furthermore, Scharff used his unique position to grant favors, creating a sense of obligation. He would allow pilots to write letters home, which he would, of course, read for intelligence. He arranged for medical care that went beyond the basic standard. In one famous instance, involving fighter ace Francis Gabby Gabreski, Scharff learned that Gabreski was deeply worried about his wife back home. Scharff arranged for a message to be passed through diplomatic channels via the Red Cross, confirming to Gabreski that his wife was safe and aware that he was a POW. This act of profound kindness shattered Gabreski's resistance. While Gabreski insisted he never revealed direct military secrets, he later admitted that his conversations with Scharff were far more open and detailed than they would have been with any other interrogator. Scharff had weaponized empathy, turning a basic human need for connection into his most effective tool. He understood that a man's spirit, if broken by force, yields little of value. But if carefully and respectfully unlocked, it could become a fountain of information. The archives of the mind, weaving the intelligence web. The nerve center of Scharff's operation was not the interrogation room itself, but his modest back office, where the real work was done. Here, away from the prisoners, the performance of the friendly, slightly forgetful interrogator gave way to the sharp, analytical mind of an intelligence officer. Scharff maintained a massive, cross-referenced card catalog system that was the envy of German military intelligence. Every scrap of information, no matter how trivial, was recorded, indexed, and filed. A pilot's hometown, the name of his squadron's mess officer, a complaint about faulty spark plugs, the location of a favorite pub near his airbase in England, everything was deemed potentially valuable. This system, which one American pilot later called the most complete and efficient personality and data file I have ever seen, was the engine that powered his illusion of knowing it all. When a new P-47 Thunderbolt pilot was captured, for instance, Scharff could pull the cards for every other P-47 pilot previously interrogated. He could review details about their specific variant, e.g., the P-47D-25, the range issues they faced on escort missions, modifications made at the field level, and the names of their squadron mates. He could then walk into the interrogation room armed with a dozen intimate, verifiable facts. The new prisoner, hearing these details, would naturally assume that the Luftwaffe already knew everything about his unit. This created a psychological feedback loop. Each interrogation enriched the database, which in turn made the next interrogation more effective. The system was so comprehensive that Scharff could often track the career of a single pilot through the comments of others. He might know a pilot had been promoted or transferred even before the pilot's own squadron mates did. This meticulous archival work was not limited to individual pilots. Scharff and his team built up a complete order of battle for the American 8th and 9th Air Forces. They tracked the arrival of new units in the European Theater of Operations, ETO, identified their airfields, and noted their operational strength. A key source for this strategic intelligence came from a place the Allies overlooked, their own press. Scharff was an avid reader of Stars and Stripes, the American military newspaper, as well as hometown newspapers from across the USA. These papers, filled with pride, would often publish stories about local boys somewhere in England, sometimes including their unit and photos of their planes. To a trained eye like Scharff's, a picture of a pilot standing in front of his P-51 could reveal the aircraft variant, squadron markings, and even the type of ground surface at the airfield, which helped in identifying its location. He pieced together the Allied mosaic one tiny, publicly available tile at a time. His card catalog was not just a collection of facts, it was a living, breathing model of the enemy air force, a testament to the power of open-source intelligence decades before the term was even coined. He demonstrated conclusively that the most valuable secrets are not always whispered in secret, sometimes they are shouted in plain sight, waiting for a patient archivist to listen. The unwanted technology, the P-51 Mustang and the G-suit. In the complex ecosystem of military intelligence, technical details about enemy equipment were prized above almost all else. The arrival of a new aircraft, a new engine, or a new piece of onboard technology could tip the delicate balance of power in the air. For Hanns Scharff, the Allied technological marvel that obsessed his superiors the most was the North American P-51 Mustang, particularly the Merlin engine variants that began to dominate the skies in 1944. Its combination of speed, range, and high-altitude performance was a mortal threat to the Luftwaffe. Scharff was under immense pressure to extract any and all information about the Mustang's capabilities and vulnerabilities. He approached this task not by asking pilots to betray their country, but by framing the discussion as a professional debate among aviators. He would sit with a captured Mustang pilot, perhaps Colonel Einar Malmstrom or Major Edwin Ed Hero, and begin with a compliment. "A magnificent machine, the P-51, he'd say, but our Focke-Wulf 190 Dora can outdive it, surely you'd agree?" This was a baited hook. The proud American pilot, unwilling to concede any point of aerial supremacy, would often retort with a detailed explanation of why Scharff was wrong, inadvertently revealing crucial performance data. "Maybe for the first 1,000 feet, the pilot might argue, but once I get my prop pitch set and trim it right, I can hold my speed and be on your tail before you pull out." In that moment, Scharff learned about optimal dive settings and recovery characteristics. An even more significant intelligence coup involved a piece of equipment pilots wore rather than flew, the G-suit. As fighter aircraft became capable of tighter turns at higher speeds, pilots were blacking out as the extreme gravitational forces, G-forces, pulled blood from their brains. The Allies developed a pneumatic anti-G suit that automatically inflated bladders around the legs and abdomen during high-G maneuvers, squeezing the pilot's body to keep blood in the upper torso and head. This gave Allied pilots a significant combat advantage, allowing them to outturn their German opponents without losing consciousness. German intelligence was aware of this technology but had only vague, third-hand descriptions. Scharff made it a priority. When he interrogated pilots who had been using the suit, he didn't ask, "How does your G-suit work?" Instead, he would feign ignorance or dismissiveness. "I hear you have some new special trousers you wear," he might say casually. "Some pilots say they are more trouble than they are worth, very uncomfortable." This prompted indignant pilots to launch into a passionate defense of their life-saving equipment. They explained precisely how it worked, the way the air bladders inflated, the G-force at which it activated, and the crucial seconds of consciousness it preserved in a dogfight. They described the physical sensation and the tactical difference it made, confirming for Scharff that it wasn't just a minor comfort item but a war-altering piece of technology. He gathered enough detailed information from these casual conversations to provide German aviation engineers with a comprehensive understanding of the suit's design and function. The irony, however, was that by the time Scharff delivered this priceless intelligence in late 1944, the German war economy was in such a state of collapse that developing and fielding a comparable suit was simply impossible. He had successfully extracted the secret, but the Reich he served was too broken to use it. The guest list: Gabreski, Johnson, and the Fraternity of Aces. The roster of Allied pilots who passed through Auswertestelle West and sat across the desk from Hans Scharff reads like a who's who of American airpower in Europe. These were not rookie pilots on their first mission. They were, by the cruel logic of aerial warfare, the most skilled, experienced, and aggressive flyers, men who survived long enough to become aces and leaders. Among them was Francis Gabby Gabreski, the top-scoring American ace in the ETO. Gabreski was shot down in July 1944 after audaciously strafing a German airfield at treetop level. When he arrived at Obergefreiter, he was defiant and mentally prepared for a brutal ordeal. He was stunned when Scharff greeted him with a smile, a history of his Polish heritage, and a complete file on his 28 aerial victories. The two developed a complex relationship built on mutual respect. It was during his interrogation of Gabreski that Scharff performed his most famous act of kindness, relaying the message to Gabreski's wife. This gesture effectively disarmed the ace. While Gabreski would forever maintain he gave up no classified information, his extensive conversations with Scharff about air combat tactics, the qualities of various German pilots he had faced, and the operational tempo of his unit provided a rich, qualitative intelligence picture for the Luftwaffe. Another prominent guest was Colonel Robert S. Johnson, a triple ace of the 56th Fighter Group who, unlike most, was not shot down but rather became lost in bad weather and landed by mistake at a German-held airfield. Johnson arrived in a state of fury and disbelief. Scharff met this anger with calm professionalism. Knowing Johnson was part of Hub Zemke's famed Wolfpack, Scharff used the information gleaned from Zemke to establish immediate credibility. He discussed Johnson's squadron mates by name, their recent missions, and even the group's baseball league scores. Johnson was astounded. Scharff took him on the now famous forest walks, and the two men, one of the USAF's highest scorers and the Luftwaffe's top interrogator, found common ground as professional airmen. They discussed the relative merits of the P-47 Thunderbolt versus the FW-190, not as an interrogation, but as a spirited debate. Johnson, defending his beloved Jug, would inadvertently highlight its strengths in withstanding damage and its weaknesses in climbing, providing valuable data for Luftwaffe pilots trying to fight it. Through these interactions, Scharff built a psychological profile of the USAF's most aggressive pilots. He learned they were not automatons but fiercely individualistic, competitive, and proud. By appealing to these traits, their pride, their expertise, their humanity, he bypassed their formal resistance training entirely. He created what amounted to an exclusive, albeit involuntary, club of captured aces, and he was its convivial host. The limits of kindness, when the Scharff method failed. While Hans Scharff's humane approach was remarkably successful, it was not foolproof. His method was predicated on building a rapport with his subject, a process that required a specific type of prisoner, a professional, disciplined officer who could be engaged on an intellectual or personal level. But the air war produced prisoners of all stripes, and some were simply immune to Scharff's charms. He found it particularly difficult to get anything from the Free French and Polish pilots who flew with the Royal Air Force. These men were not simply soldiers fighting for a nation, they were men whose homelands had been brutally conquered and occupied by the very regime Scharff served. Their hatred for Germany was visceral, personal, and absolute. For them, any German, no matter how polite or sophisticated, was the enemy. The offer of a cigarette or a pleasant walk in the woods was seen not as kindness, but as an insulting and transparent trick. Their resistance was a wall of pure, unadulterated fury that no amount of empathy could breach. They would sit in stony silence or meet his pleasantries with venom, and Scharff, recognizing the futility, would quickly end the session. He also encountered a different kind of wall with certain individuals whose personalities simply did not mesh with his technique. One such case was a high-ranking American bomber commander who was, by nature, deeply introverted and taciturn. Scharff attempted all his standard gambits, the detailed dossier, the casual conversation, the offer of comforts. The American officer simply responded to every query and every statement with a quiet, polite "I am sorry, but I cannot discuss that." There was no anger or defiance, just an unshakable, placid refusal to engage. Scharff's method relied on creating a conversational current, and this man was a stone, creating no current at all. After several days of fruitless, one-sided conversations, Scharff conceded defeat. The archival records, including Scharff's own post-war writings, show his candid admission of these failures. He understood that his technique was a psychological tool, not a magic wand. It was most effective on the proud, confident, and often talkative fighter jocks who saw themselves as knights of the modern age. It was less effective on those consumed by righteous hatred or those who possessed an impenetrable inner tranquility. These limitations provide a crucial balance to his story, reminding us that even the most sophisticated psychological methods could be defeated by the simple, raw power of human will and conviction. The shadow of the SS and the end at Stalag Luft-I. Throughout his tenure at Obergefreiter, Hans Scharff operated in a precarious position. While Auswertestelle West was a Luftwaffe facility, the ever-present and malevolent influence of the Gestapo and the SS loomed large. These organizations, led by men like Heinrich Himmler and Ernst Kaltenbrunner, viewed Scharff's methods with suspicion and contempt. To them, kindness was weakness, and interrogation was a matter of applying force until the subject broke. They could not comprehend how an Obergefreiter who took prisoners for walks could be successful. On several occasions, SS officers attempted to intervene, demanding that certain high-value prisoners be handed over to them for special treatment. Scharff, with the backing of his immediate Luftwaffe superiors who valued his results, had to engage in a delicate and dangerous bureaucratic dance to protect his guests. He would argue that the prisoners were under Luftwaffe jurisdiction according to the Geneva Conventions and that SS methods would be counterproductive, causing the pilots to shut down completely. He famously saved several downed airmen, including some from the all-black 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, from being taken by the Gestapo, who considered black personnel to be racially inferior and not entitled to POW protections. Scharff insisted they were officers and aviators, to be treated like any other. This was not just a matter of methodology, it was a quiet but firm act of defiance against the most barbaric elements of the Nazi state. As the Allied armies closed in on Germany from east and west in early 1945, the interrogation center at Oberursel was evaluated. The prisoners were to be marched to other camps deeper within Germany. In a final, remarkable act, Scharff was given a new, unofficial role. Recognizing his unique rapport with the American prisoners, his superiors tasked him with acting as a liaison and escort for a large contingent of POWs being transferred to Stalag Luftwaffe on the Baltic coast. During the chaotic and dangerous journey by train, Scharff became less a captor and more a protector. He used his authority to secure food and water for the prisoners, shielded them from hostile German civilians, and argued with SS guards who tried to mistreat them. Upon arriving at Stalag Luftwaffe, which already held Hub Zemke and many other pilots he had interrogated, the German commandant gave Scharff an extraordinary new duty. He was to be the German representative to the senior American officer in the camp, none other than Colonel Hub Zemke himself. For the final weeks of the war, captor and captive worked together, managing the camp's dwindling resources and maintaining order as the Reich crumbled around them. When the Red Army liberated the camp in May 1945, Hanns Scharff calmly surrendered to the Americans, many of whom were his former guests. His war had ended, not in a hail of bullets, but in a bizarre partnership with the very man he had been tasked to deceive. The post-war legacy, from interrogator to mosaic artist. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Hanns Scharff's unique position made him a person of great interest to the victors. Instead of being thrown into a dreary POW cage with the rest of the German military, he was taken to England by the USAF and extensively debriefed by Allied intelligence officers. They were fascinated by his methods. They studied his illusion of knowing it all technique, his emphasis on empathy, and his meticulous archival system. His approach stood in such stark contrast to the brutality they had expected that it forced a re-evaluation of their own interrogation doctrines. Key elements of the Scharff method, building rapport, avoiding threats, using known information to feign omniscience, and exploiting the subject's own ego, were formally analyzed and incorporated into U.S. military interrogation training manuals, where their influence can still be traced today. He was, in essence, the enemy who became the teacher. After his debriefing, he was cleared of any wrongdoing. The testimony of dozens of high-ranking Allied officers, including Hub Zemke and Gabi Gebreski, portrayed him as a decent man who had treated them with honor and respect, often protecting them from a worse fate. Scharff tried to rebuild his life in a shattered Germany, but the opportunities were non-existent. In 1948, with the help and sponsorship of some of his former prisoners, he was invited to immigrate to the United States. It was a testament to the strange bonds forged in his office at Oberursel. He settled in New York City, initially working a series of odd jobs. However, his life took another artistic turn. Drawing on his family's history in arts and textiles, he rediscovered a passion for mosaic art. He began creating intricate mosaic pieces, and his talent was soon recognized. He moved to Los Angeles, where he established Hanns Scharff Designs, a studio that would become famous for its large-scale architectural mosaics. His works would eventually adorn city halls, universities, schools, and even the Cinderella Castle at Walt Disney World. The man who had once pieced together scraps of information to create a mosaic of Allied military intelligence now pieced together bits of stone and glass to create enduring works of public art. He became a U.S. citizen and maintained lifelong friendships with many of the men he had interrogated, including Gabi Gebreski, who was the godfather to Scharff's daughter. Hanns Scharff's story remains one of the most curious and compelling footnotes of the Second World War, a tale of an accidental spy who became a master of his craft not through force, but through a profound and disarming understanding of human nature. Impact on the battlefield, translating conversation into countertactics. While the anecdotes of Scharff's kindness are compelling, his value to the German war machine was measured in results. The intelligence he gathered was not merely academic, it was collated, analyzed, and disseminated to Luftwaffe fighter units on the front line, directly influencing their tactics against the formidable American bomber streams and their escorts. A prime example was the intelligence gathered on the American Zemke fan tactic. Devised by Hub Zemke, this was a specific method for fighter groups to engage German interceptors. Instead of meeting the Germans head-on, the squadrons would fan out, allowing the enemy fighters to pass through their formation before turning to engage them from their vulnerable rear and flanks. Scharff, through his casual tactical discussions with pilots from the 56th Fighter Group, was able to piece together a clear picture of this maneuver. He learned how far apart the squadrons flew, their communication protocols during the maneuver, and the visual cues they used for timing. This information was passed to the Jagdwaffe fighter force leadership, who then issued new directives to their pilots: beware the staggered American formation that appears to give way. Do not penetrate. Engage the flanking elements first or execute a split-S dive to disengage and re-attack from a different vector. Another critical area was the exploitation of equipment weaknesses. Through numerous conversations, Scharff confirmed persistent problems with the early P-51 Mustang's machine guns. The .50 caliber guns, when mounted at a slight angle in the wings, had ammunition feed issues that caused frequent jamming during high-G maneuvers, especially in the cold at high altitudes. This was a secret the USAF desperately wanted to keep. Scharff's reports, however, gave Luftwaffe pilots a crucial edge. Briefings for Me-109 and FW-190 pilots began to include the advice: if a Mustang is on your tail, do not try to outrun it in level flight. Force it into a hard, sustained turn. There is a high probability his guns will jam, giving you an opportunity to escape or reverse the engagement. German pilots began reporting success with this exact tactic, breaking off from pursuing Mustangs that suddenly stopped firing. Scharff's intelligence also revealed the range limitations of different Allied fighter types on any given day, which was not a static number but one dependent on the use of external drop tanks. Learning the precise procedures for when and where escort fighters would drop their tanks to engage allowed German commanders to better time their attacks, aiming to hit the bombers just as their little friends were at the edge of their combat radius or had disengaged to return to base. In this way, the soft-spoken conversations in Oberursel were translated directly into the deadly mathematics of aerial combat over the heart of Germany. A different breed, interrogating the bomber crews. While Scharff is most famous for his work with fighter aces, Auswertestelle West was responsible for interrogating all Allied airmen, including the crews of the mighty B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators. This presented a different and, in some ways, more complex challenge. Unlike fighter pilots, who were often lone wolves or flew in small sections, bomber crews were part of a large, 10-man team. Each member, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and the various gunners, held a highly specialized but narrow slice of the mission's total information. The pilot might know the flight path, but the navigator knew the precise coordinates and wind calculations. The bombardier knew the specific aiming point and bomb load, while the radio operator knew the call signs and frequencies. No single crewman held all the keys. Furthermore, bomber crewmen often lacked the glamorous knight-of-the-air ego that Scharff so deftly exploited in fighter pilots. Their experience was one of grim, grinding endurance against flak-and fighters, and their capture was often the result of a terrifying, chaotic ordeal as their large, unwieldy aircraft was torn apart in the sky. Scharff and his team adapted their methods accordingly. The illusion of knowing it all became even more critical. They would interrogate the crew members separately, starting with those they assessed as being the most shaken or inexperienced, such as a young waist gunner. To this frightened NCO, Scharff might present a staggering amount of information his team had already assembled about the mission, the bomber group, the target, the approximate route, gathered from tracking the bomber stream on radar and from the wreckage. He would then ask a simple, seemingly trivial question: "We know you were targeting the marshalling yards at Ham, but we have you on a slightly different heading than the rest of the 381st Group. Were you having trouble with the number 3 engine?" The gunner, hearing that the Germans already knew his group and his target, might innocently reply, "No, the engine was fine. The navigator had us take a more southerly route to avoid the flak belt near Munster." This single sentence, harmless in the gunner's mind, was an intelligence windfall. It confirmed the target, the unit, and revealed a specific Allied tactic for flak avoidance. Scharff's team would then take this new fact to the navigator's interrogation, presenting it as something they already knew, using it as a stepping stone to pry loose another, more technical detail about navigation methods. By patiently working their way up the chain, playing one crewman's partial knowledge off another's, they could assemble a complete and devastatingly accurate picture of the entire mission, from takeoff to the target. Inside Room 7, the team and the method's disciples. Hanns Scharff was the master, but he was not a one-man operation. He was the head of a small, specialized section within Auswertestelle West, and he trained a handful of other interrogators in his unique methods. His primary assistant and disciple was an officer named Otto Spagel, who became a crucial partner in perpetuating the Scharff method. Scharff and Spagel worked as a team, meticulously preparing for each interrogation and sharing the workload. Their offices, designated Rooms 7 and 8, became the hub of fighter pilot intelligence. They understood that consistency was key to their success. Every pilot had to receive the same initial treatment, the polite greeting, the offer of courtesies, the non-confrontational opening. This created a consistent brand for the fighter interrogation section, one that began to spread through rumor and word of mouth in the Allied POW camps. Pilots, upon capture, would sometimes hear whispers from others who had passed through Obergefreiter, "If you get the guy who offers you a cigar and takes you for a walk, you're in luck. He's a gentleman." This reputation, paradoxically, became another tool in Scharff's kit. Prisoners arrived with a lower level of fear and anxiety, making them more susceptible to his disarming approach from the outset. The team also included clerks and analysts who managed the all-important card catalog. These men, working diligently in the background, were the foundation of the operation. They scoured captured documents, sorted personal effects, cross-referenced names and serial numbers, and transcribed the key takeaways from Scharff's and Spagel's verbal reports. Their work allowed Scharff to walk into an interrogation with a seemingly photographic memory of a pilot's entire life and career. The synergy within this small team was remarkable. While Scharff might be conducting a walk in the woods with an American colonel, Spagel might be chatting with a British Spitfire pilot, and the analysts in the back room would be linking the information from both, perhaps realizing that the two pilots had engaged in the same dogfight from opposite sides. This ability to synthesize information in near real time gave their operation a dynamism that other, more rigid intelligence units lacked. Scharff was not just a brilliant interrogator, he was also an effective manager and mentor, creating a small cadre of soft power specialists in a system that otherwise only understood the application of hard power. Their shared success in Rooms 7 and 8 stands as a testament to the replicability of his psychologically driven doctrine. The other side of the coin, contrasting with the Gestapo. To truly appreciate the revolutionary nature of Hanns Scharff's work, one must place it in the dark context of his contemporaries. While Scharff was offering coffee and conversation at Obergefreiter, other German organizations were pursuing intelligence with methods drawn from the medieval dungeon. The primary practitioners of this brutality were the Geheime Staatspolizei, Gestapo, and the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, the intelligence arm of the SS. Their interrogators operated on a simple principle: pain and terror. Captured airmen who fell into their hands, particularly those suspected of being spies or saboteurs, a label often wrongly applied to downed pilots found in civilian clothes, were taken to infamous cellars like the Gestapo headquarters at Prinz-Albrecht-Strasse in Berlin. Here, interrogation was a synonym for torture. The methods were horrific and varied: severe beatings, fingernails pulled out, teeth broken, suspension by the arms for hours, strappado, and mock executions. The goal was not to coax, but to break the prisoner's body and spirit so completely that he would say anything to make the pain stop. The intelligence derived from such methods was notoriously unreliable. A man being tortured will confess to anything, he will invent facts, confirm false theories, and implicate his comrades simply to gain a moment's respite. While the Gestapo could extract a confession, they rarely extracted credible, actionable military intelligence. An airman under torture might give a false location for his squadron's base or an incorrect radio frequency, information that was not only useless but potentially harmful if acted upon by the German military. The contrast with Scharff could not be more stark. Scharff sought to make the prisoner a willing, if unwitting, participant in a conversation. The Gestapo sought to reduce the prisoner to a screaming animal. Scharff's method yielded nuanced, verifiable details about tactics and technology. The Gestapo's method yielded coerced confessions and fabricated data. This fundamental difference was a source of constant friction. Archival records show Luftwaffe commanders repeatedly complaining that when the Gestapo pre-interrogated a captured pilot, he was often rendered useless for further, more skillful questioning by Scharff's team. The pilot would either be too physically and psychologically traumatized to speak coherently or so filled with hatred and terror that he would never trust any German again, no matter how kind. Scharff's success was a quiet, implicit condemnation of the entire philosophy of terror upon which the Nazi state was built. The pet bear and other absurdities, maintaining morale at Obergefreiter. The atmosphere at Auswertestelle West, particularly in Scharff's section, was often surreal, a pocket of strange civility amidst a world at war. This was not an accident but a deliberate part of the strategy. Scharff understood that breaking the grinding monotony and fear of captivity was essential to making a prisoner receptive. To this end, he fostered an environment that was as far removed from a typical POW facility as possible. One of the most bizarre and well-documented features of the camp was a pet bear. A young black bear cub, apparently the former mascot of a Luftwaffe unit, was kept on the grounds. Scharff would sometimes take American pilots, including Hub Zemke, to see and even play with the bear. This act served multiple purposes. It was a powerful disruptor of expectations. No one anticipates playing with a bear cub upon being captured by the enemy. It created a shared, humanizing experience that had nothing to do with the war, providing a foundation for a non-adversarial relationship. It also became a legendary story, passed from pilot to pilot, contributing to the mystique of Scharff and the strangeness of the camp. Beyond the bear, Scharff employed other small but significant tactics to maintain a sense of normalcy and morale. He would organize gatherings where he would serve his guests good food, often from his own Red Cross packages, and allow them to converse among themselves, always, of course, within earshot of a hidden microphone or a German plant posing as a fellow POW. He discovered that many pilots were avid model aircraft builders. He procured balsa wood and tools and encouraged them to build models of their own planes. While the pilots enjoyed the hobby, Scharff and his team would carefully observe their work, noting the fine details of engine cowlings, cockpit layouts, or antenna placements that the pilots incorporated from memory, revealing technical details they would never speak aloud. He created a reality where his prisoners were treated more like residents of a slightly eccentric boarding house than captives of a brutal regime. This meticulously crafted absurdity was the final layer of his psychological artifice. By making life at Obergefreiter oddly pleasant and humane, he made resistance seem churlish and unnecessary. He was fighting a war of information, and his most potent weapon was the creation of a temporary, unbelievable peace. The art of the apparent mistake, exploiting ego and expertise. A cornerstone of the Scharff method, and perhaps its most subtle element, was the deliberate and calculated use of misinformation. Scharff understood a fundamental aspect of human psychology, particularly among highly skilled professionals, the innate urge to correct an error. Pride in one's expertise is a powerful motivator. After establishing a friendly, conversational atmosphere, Scharff would pivot to a technical or operational topic, but he would present his knowledge with carefully seeded inaccuracies. This was the pinnacle of his performance. He would not ask, "What is the maximum effective range of the P-47D with two 108-gallon drop tanks?" a question that would immediately trigger a prisoner's counterinterrogation training. Instead, he would state with confidence, "Of course, the great weakness of your Thunderbolt is the range. Even with drop tanks, we know you are completely dry of fuel by the time you reach the Dutch border." This statement was designed to be galling to a Yuzov pilot who had just escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The pilot's professional pride would be wounded. The natural, almost uncontrollable response was to correct the record. "What are you talking about?" the pilot might scoff. "I can fly to Berlin, hang around for 20 minutes of combat, and still make it back to England with fuel to spare. You just have to know how to manage your fuel mixture and RPMs." In that one indignant outburst, the pilot had just confirmed the P-47's true combat radius, alluded to specific fuel-saving techniques, and given a time frame for their loiter capability over the target, a trifecta of priceless intelligence. Scharff used this technique to dissect all aspects of Allied air operations. He might misidentify a squadron's commanding officer, prompting a pilot to reveal the new commander's name and perhaps his reputation. He would misstate the frequencies used by fighter groups, leading a radio operator to inadvertently confirm the correct frequency band. He would describe an Allied tactic, like the Luftwaffe circle, a defensive maneuver, but get the entry procedure wrong, causing a pilot to explain the correct way to do it. Each correction was a small victory, a single thread pulled from the tightly woven cloth of Allied secrecy. The genius of this approach was that the prisoner never felt he was confessing or betraying anything. In his own mind, he was simply setting a misinformed but pleasant German straight. He was defending the honor and competence of his unit and his air force. Scharff had transformed the act of interrogation into an ego-stroking exercise for the prisoner, who would leave the session feeling superior and intellectually victorious, never realizing he had been the one who had been masterfully played. It was psychological judo of the highest order, using the prisoner's own strength, his pride and expertise, to gently throw him off balance. Recognition from the enemy, the USAAF post-war analysis. In the aftermath of the war, as Allied intelligence teams sifted through the ruins of the Third Reich, they sought not only to document German crimes but also to learn from their successes. Hence, Scharff and Auswertestelle West became a major focus of a U.S. Army Air Force's study on German methods of interrogation. The resulting reports are a testament to the profound impact Scharff had, not on the war itself, but on the future of intelligence gathering. American investigators, accustomed to a binary view of their enemy as either bumbling fanatics or monstrous sadists, were astonished by the sophistication and humanity of Scharff's system. They interviewed dozens of former POWs, Zemke, Gabreski, Johnson, and many others, who, to a man, described Scharff with respect and even a degree of affection. The American report, declassified decades later, reads like a manual on how to replicate his success. It codifies his techniques, the friendly approach, the creation of a non-adversarial atmosphere, the establishment of rapport before questioning, and, most importantly, the technique of appearing to know everything in order to gain confirmation. The report specifically highlighted the contrast between Scharff's Luftwaffe facility and its counterparts in the Gestapo and SS. It noted that the Luftwaffe interrogators secured a far greater quantity of more reliable information than any other German agency. The analysis concluded that coercion and torture were not only morally bankrupt but also operationally ineffective, a conclusion that would have significant influence on the development of Western intelligence doctrine during the Cold War. In a sense, the greatest validation of Scharff's methods came from his former enemies. The USAAF effectively reverse-engineered his psychological toolkit. They recognized that the core of his success was not deception, but a foundation of genuine respect for the prisoner as a fellow professional. The final report recommended that American military interrogators be trained in building rapport, using open-source intelligence to create detailed dossiers, and employing conversational techniques over direct confrontation. Hanns Scharff, the humble corporal, had unwittingly become a posthumous instructor to the very Air Force he had fought against. His legacy was cemented not in a German archive, but in the training curriculum of the United States military. The bonds of captivity, an unlikely and lifelong friendship. Perhaps the most human and surprising aspect of Hanns Scharff's story is what happened after the guns fell silent. The relationships he forged in his office at Obergefreiter did not end when the POWs were liberated. In the years following his immigration to the United States, Scharff made a concerted effort to reconnect with the men he had interrogated. This was not a tentative or awkward reunion, but a warm embrace between men who shared a unique and intense life experience. The most prominent of these friendships was with Gabi Gabreski. The two men, the top American ace of the ETO and his German interrogator, became close personal friends. They visited each other's homes, their families became acquainted, and when Scharff's daughter was born, he asked Gabreski to be her godfather, an honor the American ace gladly accepted. This bond, born in a POW transit camp, lasted for the rest of their lives. This was not an isolated case. Scharff maintained a lively correspondence with Hub Zemke, Robert S. Johnson, and numerous other pilots. They would exchange Christmas cards, share news of their families and careers, and sometimes meet at Air Force reunions. At these events, Scharff was not an outcast but a celebrated, if curious, guest of honor. The American aces would gather around him, laughing and retelling the stories of their interrogations, slapping him on the back and introducing him to their fellow veterans as the guy who knew more about us than we did. This bizarre post-war fraternity defies easy explanation. It speaks to the deep respect that existed between professional aviators, a mutual understanding that transcended national enmity. For these pilots, Scharff was not the face of Nazism. He was the man who had shown them decency in a time of barbarism, the captor who had treated them with honor, and the man who had protected them from the far greater horrors of the SS. Their friendship was a testament to Scharff's character, proof that his kindness was not merely a tactic, but an authentic part of his being. He had successfully separated the man from the uniform, both in his own actions and in the minds of his prisoners. An economic perspective, the scarcity that fueled the method. To fully comprehend why Scharff's methods were not only successful but also necessary, one must look at the broader economic context of wartime Germany. The Third Reich's war economy, particularly from 1943 onwards, was one of increasing scarcity and desperation. While Scharff's humane approach stemmed from his personal philosophy, it was also remarkably resource-efficient. Brutal interrogations require significant infrastructure, soundproofed cells, specialized equipment, and a large number of guards. More importantly, they often result in physically or psychologically damaged prisoners who then become a long-term drain on the captor's medical and logistical resources. Scharff's method, by contrast, was cheap. It required little more than an office, a pot of coffee, a sharp mind, and a well-organized filing system. His weapons were conversation, research, and empathy, all infinitely renewable resources. In an economy where steel, fuel, and even food were being strictly rationed for the front, a low-cost, high-yield intelligence operation was immensely valuable. Furthermore, Scharff's use of open-source intelligence, like Allied newspapers, was a direct response to the Luftwaffe's diminishing ability to conduct aerial reconnaissance over Britain. As the RAF and USAF gained air superiority, German reconnaissance flights became suicide missions. Scharff's patient accumulation of data from newspapers, POW letters, and interrogation became a substitute for photographs and direct observation. He was rebuilding a picture of the enemy's order of battle from the ground up because Germany could no longer see it from the sky. The acts of kindness, such as sharing his own food packages, were made more potent by the general deprivation of wartime Germany. A piece of chocolate or a real cigarette was not just a courtesy, it was a significant luxury that created a genuine sense of gratitude and obligation in the recipient. Scharff's entire operation can be viewed as a form of asymmetric intelligence warfare. Lacking the resources for conventional intelligence gathering and the industrial capacity to immediately act on all technical secrets, Germany's best recourse was the deep, qualitative understanding of enemy tactics, morale, and vulnerabilities that only a mind like Hanns Scharff could provide. His method was perfectly suited for a nation that had more intelligent people than it had material resources. Final analysis: the legacy of the gentleman interrogator. Hanns-Joachim Scharff's story is a profound anomaly in the grim annals of the Second World War. He was a man who fought his war with intellect and empathy, proving that in the quest for secrets, the human connection is a more effective key than the crowbar of brutality. His legacy is multifaceted. First, as an intelligence professional, he pioneered a psychological, non-coercive interrogation doctrine that was so effective his enemies adopted it as their own. He demonstrated the overwhelming power of meticulous research and open-source intelligence, a lesson that remains central to modern intelligence analysis. Second, as a historical figure, he serves as a powerful counternarrative. In a conflict often remembered for its monolithic evil and industrial-scale slaughter, Scharff represents the significance of individual decency and professionalism. His protection of prisoners from the Gestapo and his insistence on upholding the Geneva Conventions were not grand acts of resistance, but they were meaningful assertions of morality in a system that sought to extinguish it. He reminds us that even within the machinery of a totalitarian state, individual choices matter. Finally, his life story is a testament to the strange and resilient nature of the human spirit. The friendships he maintained with his former captives defy the logic of war. They suggest that shared respect among professionals and the memory of kindness in a moment of extreme vulnerability can forge bonds stronger than national hatred. From a reluctant panzergrenadier to a master interrogator, and finally to a celebrated mosaic artist in the country he once fought against, Scharff's journey is one of remarkable transformation. He did not change the outcome of the war. Germany's defeat was sealed by overwhelming industrial might and strategic failure. But he profoundly changed the lives of the men who fell into his hands, and in doing so, left an indelible mark on the history of military intelligence. The archives on Hanns Scharff are not just a record of espionage, they are a deep and abiding lesson in psychology, morality, and the complex, often contradictory, nature of man. He remains, and will likely forever remain, the war's most unlikely and humane master of secrets.